Okay, I think we have a critical mass, so we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kendra Freeman. I am the Director of Community Development and Engagement for the Metropolitan Planning Council. And thanks so much for joining us this Wednesday morning for Power and Privilege. How do we keep racial equity at the forefront as we make our way through COVID-19? We're excited to have with us as guest presenter Tuyet M. And it's going to be a smaller group today, and we did that purposefully so we can have a more interactive session. So we hope that you'll lean into participation today. So I want to go over just a few housekeeping issues. We'll be in this Zoom meeting, so if you can leave your camera off, you could leave your camera on during the presentation. We would encourage people to turn their cameras on during the small breakout group discussion so we can have a bit of a more intimate session and really connect with folks as we're digging into some of those questions in the smaller discussions. Please use the chat box. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to throw them into the chat box. We'll be monitoring that, and there'll be a couple of spots where we'll call on you to pose your questions if you need to. You can also use the raise your hand feature as well, which is under the participants tab, but you can also use the chat box to introduce yourself, to give a thumbs up or a comment about anything you hear that resonates with you as well. We love that and we encourage that. I also just wanted to remind everyone that this session is being recorded. So the small group discussions will not be recorded, but the presentation and the group sessions will be recorded. And I should also warn you that the chats, even though you may be sending private chats to one another, they're not private. So they all come up in our chat log at the end of the session. So if there's something you want to send to somebody else that you really don't want us to see at the end of the day, that's just a fair warning. But if you're not familiar with the Metropolitan Planning Council, we are an independent, not-for-profit planning and policy change organization. And the values of equity and improving the built environment are really central to our mission and our daily work. We're super excited for our ongoing partnership with Elevated Chicago. And this is actually the 4th workshop in our series focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion that's really devoted to building competency in DEI in the planning and related community development fields. So this series has been a broader part of the effort to develop a model for a learning cohort that will engage professionals across sectors who deal with the built environment and community development and the work that really help to shape our communities. We have a really incredible team that we've been working with, building content for each of these webinars and the eventual learning cohort over the past several months. And I just wanted to acknowledge and thank Tiffany McDowell and Heather Smith for their leadership on our design team. As you learn today, and please think about like what you'll find valuable. We are taking the feedback and the questions that you'll respond to in a survey to really help shape and continue to strengthen this content. So please take some time to reflect on what you found valuable, and please take a few minutes towards the end of the session to really give us some honest feedback. And now I'd like to invite my colleague, Roberta Requejo, who is a program director for Elevate Chicago, to share a bit more about our DEI project and also to introduce our presenter. Roberto.
Hi, thank you, Kendra, and thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. My name is Roberto Requejo, and I am the program director of Elevated Chicago. We are a collaborative of community-based organizations and regional partners advancing equitable transit-oriented development, or ETOD. And we work within the half mile of 7 Chicago Transit Authority stations located in majority Black and majority Latino neighborhoods here in Chicago. Our goal is to address racial inequities in public health, in climate resiliency, and in arts and culture, and to stop displacement and depopulation in communities of color. And we do this in partnership with amazing organizations like MPC. We invest in bricks and mortar projects near transit led by communities such as affordable housing, green infrastructure, health clinics, business incubators. But we knew from the beginning that investing in development was not enough. We also needed a strong systems change agenda to influence the policies, the practices, and the culture of planning and development in our region. So one of the main priorities of that agenda is to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion among leaders and professionals in fields that affect the built environment, like all of you, to make sure that decisions that we all make that end up shaping communities are helping to build equity in neighborhoods. But as many of you know, advancing DEI in Chicago is challenging. Historically, the fields that impact the built environment in our city have contributed intentionally and unintentionally to extract wealth from communities of color, to disinvest in them, to disconnect them from opportunities, to segregate them racially, and also to displace their residents. And so we believe that we need to radically change the relationship between those of us who make decisions about the built environment and the communities impacted by those decisions. And we also believe that we need more and better diversity, equity, and inclusion in the fields where we work, whether we work in a planning department, a development firm, or a bank investing in community development. Our annual symposium is coming up this Friday, July 31st at noon Central. So if you want to learn more about our work, you can go to our website, elevatedchicago.org, and register. I think there's a slide now showing you one of the many challenges that we need to confront. The leadership in the sectors that impact our built environment, like real estate, construction, or transportation, is very far from reflecting the communities we serve. And in some of these sectors, the presence of people of color in senior executive positions, as you can see, is in the single digits. If you could move the slide forward, we could show you that this is in a way our theory of change for this series of webinars and our learning cohort. Our idea is to move us from the reality we're living today into the future that we want to see. And we know that today the relationship between our field on the left and our communities on the right is not a healthy one. Chicago's built environment is both the cause and the effect of many DEI gaps, and many of them have been in place for over a century, almost two. And yet the main decision makers in the space, or what we call the field, lack a common understanding of DEI, a joint vision and framework, spaces and resources to work together, etc. As a result, organizations are not diverse, leaders and processes are not inclusive enough, and racial equity is rarely a priority. And so we continue to be one of the most segregated global cities in the world. Socioeconomic indicators for people of color are consistently lower than for whites, for instance, in health, in wealth, and life expectancy. Interracial conflicts abound and gaps continue to grow. And the recent COVID-19 crisis has revealed once again and very painfully how communities that have been neglected by our field are suffering disproportionately the effects of the pandemic. So the next slide shows you that we can build a different field, one that has a well-defined and well-resourced DI vision and plan, and one that connects with communities in a radically different way, to disrupt the status quo and to have community own the processes. We also know that deconstructing our field and building it back as a diverse, equitable, and inclusive one starts with people like you, many of whom have been advocates for DEI in their organizations and communities for years. So once again, thank you for joining us today in this session. We have a great diversity, equity, and inclusion expert today to help us deconstruct our field and rebuild it with a racial equity lens at its center. Tuyet M. She has a ton of professional and lived experience in the fields of social justice and DEI, and has prepared a really engaging and practical workshop titled Power and Privilege: How do we keep racial equity at the forefront as we make our way through COVID-19? Tuyet, thank you for leading today's session.
Great, thank you, Roberto, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I want to start by thanking the Metropolitan Planning Council and Elevated Chicago for their partnership on this presentation. I am currently a nonprofit consultant and coach, and I had been the executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago for almost 19 years. And its mission was to build power through collective advocacy and organizing to achieve racial equity. And so racial equity has been a big part of my career and continues to be one of my passions. So I am gonna figure out how to share my screen to show the slides that I have for the presentation. Okay. Can you all see that okay?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. So the things that I wanted to talk about, right, is that, you know, as Roberto said, how are we keeping racial equity at the forefront? And we're going to have different ways of, for you to engage with polls and small group discussion, right? So I want you to be ready for that. And I encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat box. We have a couple people who will be monitoring that, and I'll try to answer them, or we can discuss them, right? I'm here learning with you. This is a whole new world for some of us, or just a different way that we can keep thinking about this. So I'm learning with and from you too. COVID has revealed a lot of the racial inequities that many of us already knew existed. And governments and many of us have been acting with urgency and trying to create solutions. But unfortunately, some of those solutions may be exacerbating the racial inequities that already exist, right? So how do we skillfully address our urgent needs while not sacrificing our racial equity goals? I'm proposing that one way to do this is to understand how racial equity shows up or doesn't show up in our lives, in our professional, personal, community, and these different realms. So I'm going to introduce a tool for transformational change called the Wheel of Change. And then we're going to have present a case study about something that's happening here in Chicago and right now, and having a discussion about that. And then have you all talk to each other to connect these different concepts with what's happening in real life. And at the end, to take a moment to think about the kinds of actions that you want to commit to. So, you know, hopefully we'll be getting into some discussions and, you know, just things to keep in mind. Listen for understanding, right? Assume good or neutral intent. Stay curious, right? Like, what are you wondering about? If something is, you know, not something that you're used to, and then participate as is comfortable for you. I'm realizing during COVID, I am more of an introvert than I ever imagined, and so I want this to be an invitation for you to participate, right? People learn in different ways. So this, in this moment, right, of COVID and the racial justice uprisings, it's causing so much uncertainty. And some people are wanting things to go back to normal. But some of us are asking, how can we do that knowing what we know now, right? And we're actually calling for transformational change. So I want to introduce this tool to begin identifying a way to think about how to make these big changes. The Wheel of Change is this concept developed by Robert Gass, who's an organizational development guru in my mind. It asserts that to make real change, real and sustainable change, we must work skillfully in 3 domains of life. Hearts and minds, which is the full range of what people think and feel, their motivations, beliefs, emotions, behaviors, what human beings actually do, words, deeds, choices, and structures. Structures and systems, processes that we use in terms of getting things done, right? These 3 domains continually reinforce each other, which is why in systems, they tend to resist change, right? Everyone and everything is interconnected and part of this larger system. So often change efforts that are focused on only few variables may not actually achieve the transformation we're looking for. So even though we experience something that may seem like progress in one area, right, the system is often larger than that, and like a rubber band, it tends to pull itself back into a homeostasis of the pre-change conditions, right? And so the idea here is that we must attend to all three domains in order to make the kinds of changes that we want. So first is, again, the hearts and minds, right? What are the thoughts and feelings and beliefs that we have? The stories about how things are, right? Right now, it's opening up to whose stories get told. It's also about what we believe is possible or not possible, right? So what is our imagination allowing us to, where's our imagination allowing to take us? So the idea that we want to talk about today that is the hearts and minds part is racial equity, right? And so I just want to offer a brief definition of that as both an outcome, right, that we achieve racial equity when race no longer determines one's socioeconomic outcomes, when everyone has what they need to thrive. And also as a process, right, we apply racial equity when those most impacted by structural racial inequities are meaningfully involved in the creation and implementation of institutional policies, practices that impact their lives, right? So I think it's important to think of this as both what's the end result, but really who is involved, right? Who's included, who has the power to make those decisions. So I want to share what an example of racial equity principles could look like, right? So this is an excerpt from Black Space Manifesto, which is written by Black Space Urbanist Collective. They're a group of Black urban planners, architects, artists, activists, and designers. So this is only some of them. I really encourage you to check out the full manifesto. Their website is on this slide. And, before I go through this, I just want to say that we're going to talk about, or we're going to do a poll for them of questions for you to react to the things that I'm going to read off here, right? And again, you can follow along on the slide, but the idea, so some of these principles include create circles, not lines, right? So create less hierarchy, more dialogue, inclusion, empowerment, celebrate, catalyze, and amplify Black joy. Black joy is a radical act. Give due space to joy, laughter, humor, and gratitude, right? Another concept they have is plan with, design with, walk with people as they imagine and realize their own futures, be connectors, conveners, and collaborators, not representatives, right? So seek people at the margins, acknowledge the structures that create, maintain, and uphold inequity, learn and practice new ways of intentionally making space for marginalized voices, stories, and bodies. Reckon with the past to build the future. Meaningfully acknowledge the histories, injustice, innovations, and victories of spaces and places before new work begins. Reckon with the past as a means of healing, building trust, and deepening understanding of self and others. And then finally on here is manifest the future. Black people, Black culture, and Black spaces exist in the future. Imagine and design the future into existence now, working inside and outside of social and political systems, right? So you can see some of the different parts of the definition showing up into these principles that they have laid out, right? So, so now it's for you to kind of share you're thinking about this, or at least your reaction to them. Debbie, if you could launch the polls. Right, so if you could take a minute to react, what ideas draw you in most? Okay. Okay, great. So are you all able to see the results? Yes, okay, great. So it looks like reckon with the past to build the future is the one that is drawing folks in. I don't know if, and you all can see the rest of the results. Does anyone want to share what they chose and want to say a little bit about it? It doesn't have to be the top answer. You can just share what you picked. Some of you may have picked more than one idea. So this is time to participate, or I invite you to participate.
Good morning.
Hi.
Hi, this is Tabs Cleveland. I chose Reckon with the Past to build the future only because when I think about where we are now, I always think about how did we get here. And one of the proverbs says that without a lack of knowledge, people perish. And so in order for us to get to the point to where we want to have a manifest of a future where all spaces are safe and are bringing joy and bringing the quality of life higher, you have to reckon with the past. You have to learn those lessons that we did not learn from in order to make the future better. And so I think as planners, architects, and even in the medical field or any field, you have to have a knowledge of the past and what things that we did that worked, understand the injustices and the racism that still is prevalent because of those decisions that were made in order to make things better.
Great, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Any others want to share what they chose, or, you know, again, it does not have to be that top choice either. Okay, so we have a couple more questions. Debbie, can you launch the second poll? All right, so this one is about anything that surprises you, you know, or makes you curious, right? Okay. Okay, great. So it looks like Manifest the Future is the one that is surprising or making folks curious, right? That one is that talks about Black people, Black culture, Black spaces exist in the future. So does anyone want to share that, or actually just the answers to any of or their thoughts on any of the principles and what either surprised them or makes them curious? You can also share it in the chat if you're a little camera shy. Okay. We'll have a chance to have a discussion after all three polls are out there. But Debbie, can you launch the last poll then? So the last one here again is which ideas seem challenging to you, right? Both in terms of like maybe something you haven't heard before, maybe something you've tried, maybe something something you've tried that you've seen as difficult. Okay, great, thank you. So it looks like seek people at the margins is something that is an idea that seems challenging. Yeah, I would, as a non-planner, I would love to hear more about what that might mean, either in your industry, what you're seeing as challenging about that, or again, I invite comment on any of the questions or the principles that that are here. Okay, yeah, Chloe, go ahead.
Morning. I chose the seeking people at the margins too, as well as plan with and design with as being challenging. I think this notion of being collaborators and not representatives, I think can be really challenging, especially as we work with like governmental agencies a lot, that the whole concept of government, that we're taught in like civics class growing up, is like, these are people that are supposed to represent you. So how do we kind of break that that idea and lean more towards collaborating, I think is just a challenge to think about.
Yeah, thank you. Have other people sort of thought about this question and want to share their thoughts on this? And again, I invite comments on any of the principles.
So Tuyet, there's a comment by Neural in the chat box. Maybe they want to come off mute and talk a little bit about their comment.
Good morning, everybody. This is Neural, member of the National Association of Asian American Professionals. I put create circles only because I'm personally trying to do that in organizations I'm involved in. I think there's so much hierarchy, top-down structures, and plutocracy where like the biggest donor or contributor or funder sort of calls the shots, that it's important to model other ways and at all levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, anyone else want to share this, or if you were a little shy earlier on the questions, share some ideas or reactions to, and even there's reactions to the principles in general. Because I think what is interesting about the principles is that they do touch on the different aspects of the wheel of change, right? And so the idea of and racial equity, right? So there's parts about hearts and minds and how to think about different ideas, parts about like what to do in terms of seeking people, and starting to think about systems and structures, right? This idea of reckoning with the past. How do you build that into your systems? So, so they're touching on all of in these principles. They're touching on the different ideas that are encompassed in the wheel of change, right? So, I don't know if that shifting means somebody wants to say something. But okay. So, all right, well, thank you very much, everybody, for that. We will go on to the next couple of slides. Okay, so again, I just want to remind us of what we're talking about. The second domain I want to go over is behaviors, right? What are the choices to act? These are choices to act or not act. There are also words, deeds, habits, the norms and agreements by which a group operates, right? And here is where I actually want to introduce the idea of power, where you know, it can be defined as the ability to cause or influence an outcome. Right? It's not the ability to control a situation, because control is always limited, right? And so so the idea is that we all have different levels of power, and some are seen and some is unseen. Many times people think of themselves as having little or no power, especially if they don't have positional power, like they're not the boss. Right, and as we're witnessing, everyday people are organizing together to create their own power, right? So it's not to deny that there aren't sets of people that have power over others, but that there's alternative ways of creating power, and often collective power. So and also there's just many ways that we can have influence. Sometimes it seems small. But it can be things like just asking, you know, who else should be at the table, right? That is a behavior that, or even a norm that organizations can adopt, right, before they launch into things in terms of a way to be more inclusive, right? But alternatively, it can also be, and maybe is more typical, is that we're staying silent when we notice that everyone in the room looks the same. And so there's different ways that we can use our power that can start to disrupt the way things have always been, right? But that's only one part of it. So structures, right? These are just sort of like systems and processes by which we work and live, right? What are the rules of your organization, right? Personnel policies, or the way, you know, the way you handle meetings and who gets included in those. They can be tools and technologies and strategies, right? This strategy includes this set of people, but not necessarily that set of people. It can even be things like schedules, right? You want to do all these changes, but there's no time, or the way you think about your schedule doesn't allow for it. And then, of course, there's the external environment and realities. And the thing to think about is that these structures are based on a set of assumptions, and these assumptions can be taken for granted as the way things are or have to be, right? Somebody sets those rules, that's just the way it is, is what sometimes people say. So here is actually where I want to talk about privilege, right? And that is because it often hides inside systems. So here I really like the ideas from Everyday Feminism. And I think you've probably seen these definitions before, right? That privilege is a set of unearned benefits given to people who fit into a specific social group, right? Society grants privileges to people because of certain aspects of their identity, and there can be all sorts of aspects of the identity. I thought what I really liked about it is because I know people struggle with privilege, right? Especially when if they are a beneficiary group, it's hard to see privilege. And so, but often people understand oppression, right? Even if they're not experiencing it themselves, because it's easier to notice. So, so the idea is that if you see racial oppression, who is the group that is benefiting and therefore privileged, right? So I thought it was a really, sometimes almost like a definition by, you know, the opposite, by explaining the opposite, that I thought was a very helpful way to start thinking about it, because again, often people with privilege don't understand that that is not necessarily the norm for everyone. So again, we have to, when we think about privilege and these structures, we have to remember that these structures are created by people in power to support certain behaviors and beliefs, right? And so if those things are not inclusive of everyone, or not, you know, that again, there may not have the most racially equitable goals in mind, right? And so we have to challenge those assumptions. So putting all of this together, I just want to kind of give you a really quick example kind of how this can fit together. So, you know, a lot of people have these transformational change ideas of like wanting to be healthy, right? And so how do you fit all these things together? So like this is like, you know, like many other people, this is one of mine, right? For hearts and minds, I think healthy thoughts. I think about eating vegetables. I think about exercising, right? Sometimes it only stays in hearts and minds, right? So that's where you have to be clear about also including behaviors, right? That I take walks in the morning, right? So that is an activity that leads to being healthy. But then what are the structures that support or hinder that activity, right? So I have a flexible schedule. I can wake up early or change my schedule to wake up early and exercise. I have a friend to come by to walk in the morning, right? So there's some support and accountability that I have built in as a structure. And then environmentally, my neighborhood is safe and the sidewalks are even and comfortable to walk on. Right, and so again, that structural part, what is taken for granted? Not everyone has sidewalks in their neighborhoods. Not everyone's neighborhood is some place they feel comfortable walking around in, right? And so just these are the kind of structures that affect people's lives that may hinder their behavior and therefore their hearts and minds. So it's not as sometimes as simple. Right, we can't make these kinds of assumptions based on what we know about our own lives and apply it to other people's lives. So I want to, actually, I'm going to stop right now before we go to the case study to see if there's any questions or comments that folks have. Yeah. And I see Kendra has a comment about privilege is harder to see, but just as damaging, right? So any questions folks have about the things that I've talked about so far? Okay.
Tuyet?
Yeah.
Hi, it's Mary Sue Barrett with the Metropolitan Planning Council.
Hi.
And I just want to comment because I get to work with planners with all of the gifts that they bring, but I also work on policy change. And I thought that this framework was really helpful to any of our transformational change efforts. I think it's true about investments, it's true about planning, physical things, but also about policies and where dollar decisions flow. So I just wanted to bring that into the conversation that I think it is very relevant to think about physical space and those decisions, but also about how power and exclusion and structures can get in the way whenever we're trying to move change.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, exactly. And these are, I used a very personal, individual way of thinking about transformational change. But as you said, this can be organizations, systems, like ecosystems of planning, the planning community, right, and society as a whole, right? So, to just think about what is the ecosystem of change, and that this framework can be used for these different realms. So thank you for adding that. Yeah. Any other comments folks want to make? Okay, great. So we're going to move on to a case study about something that's actually happening right now. Every day I open up my browser and there's just like a new update on what's going on with the situation. So I'm sure folks might have even more information about this. And I just want to welcome that sharing. Again, we're learning from each other as well. And so this is just, again, going to present some of the ideas that are out there and have you all have a discussion about this particular case with General Iron relocating their recycling facility to another neighborhood on the southeast side. And what can you, to start applying some of the things in this wheel of change, start naming the behaviors and the ideas behind this and some of the structures that are affecting this situation, right? Because I think the first part is to be aware and start naming the dynamics and to see where we can have our influence on these different things. So just to give folks a background about what is going on, General Iron is a scrap metal shredding facility, and it's currently located along the Chicago River in Lincoln Park. And this is a picture of their facility. As many of you know, Lincoln Park neighbors, the Lincoln Park neighbors have long complained about the health risks caused by the air pollution and something called fluff that the facility produces, which seems to be this sort of black, fluffy stuff that is produced and just accumulates in sidewalk cracks and everywhere, right? And during this pandemic, neighbors have been asking for the facility to be closed, right? We know that COVID travels through the air, it affects people's lungs, and so this whole situation is exasperating what is happening in the neighborhood. So, so they are, General Iron plans to close that plant and move to a different neighborhood on the southeast side, right? So here I put pink arrows where they currently are up here in the top part of the map, and the arrow that's pointing up and down is the Lincoln Park area, and then the new neighborhood in the Calumet area is down in the southeast side. It is 80% Latinx and is already home to a heavy concentration of industry and has just actually had a long history of industrial exploitation of the neighborhood. And the map that this is on was released by the city over the weekend in their report on air quality and health index. And so what they did was this map is based on not just the air quality, but also takes into account the health outcomes and socioeconomic metrics in the neighborhoods, right? So you can see Lincoln Park area is generally looking much healthier than the new area that the facility wants to move to, right? And already the alderman has written to the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency about how the area has really suffered over the years from high rates of lung cancer, chronic obstruction, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, right? So all of this is, you know, these health concerns that cause these underlying health conditions that COVID really affects, right? So these are, you know, sort of a map of what we're seeing is, again, a reminder and a revealing of racial inequities that exist in our city. So I see Roberto has put the full report in the chat box for you to read further, right? And so as you can imagine, activists have been fighting this move in citing that this is environmental racism, right? To move it from a wealthier white community into a community of color that has these health risks that exist already. Yeah, and unfortunately, so there's a couple of things that the company needs to do before they're allowed to move. The EPA did actually, you know, had drafted a permit for their move. And this was back in earlier this year in May or so. And of course, there was no public comment meeting due to COVID restrictions, like no in-person meeting. So the agency held virtual hearings in mid-May. It allowed people to phone in feedback, but you know, people were having problems accessing the online platform. And then the hearings were in English, and there were not other language accommodations, right? And so obviously that's really important for engaging neighbors who are Spanish speaking, which is, you know, a significant portion of the new neighborhood that they were moving into, right? So here's a picture of Gina Ramirez, who is a community organizer on the southeast side, right? Was just very concerned about, you know, the plant moving near her home, right? Yeah, as I think about this as an organizer in my other work, this is such a very COVID picture, because usually you think of like the organizing as lots and lots of people, but you know, she has to be here on her own and have her own new form of protest. So so you know, and she's just one of many people who are doing that work in the southeast side to fight this move. So, and then just in mid-May, there was a major explosion at the plant and, you know, closing it down, at least temporarily. And soon after, the IEPA granted the construction permit for the new site anyway. And it said that they could not consider past violations in making their decision. So now the city officials, the Chicago city officials, would still need to approve the relocation in order for it to move forward. And as of just a couple of days ago or so, the mayor committed to pushing for zoning reform ordinances to reduce air pollution in certain residential areas that are surrounded by industrial plants. But has at this point not committed to blocking General Iron's move, right? So that is the state of, that's sort of the story behind the General Iron move and the situation, and just where it stands now. I'm sure tons of people might be more familiar with what's going on now. If you want to ask questions or offer other insights, into this story before we break into small groups for you to discuss this a little bit further. But yeah, I'll open it up now to questions or additions to this case right now.
This is Josh from MPC. Thanks for that. Can I add just a piece of the story? It's not a little piece of the story, but yeah, that comes before some of that. In that, to me, at least, this notion of the move is an inevitable result of the way that the previous administration approached industrial corridor planning, and that they, rather than have a comprehensive citywide industrial plan that accounted for the pros and cons of things moving different places and included lots of voices, they started with developing a corridor plan for that Lincoln Park area, which led to rezoning and whatever. And it felt inevitable to folks who were watching it that General Iron and many others were going to start to move elsewhere, and yet no planning was put in place for the other industrial cores in the city. And so now this has happened, and it feels so predictable. And yet here we are.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. Does someone else want to share?
Hi, this is the architect. Let me go on camera real quick.
Yeah.
Hi. So, to Josh's point, I think it's really interesting when you go back to the Black Space Manifesto and their kind of principles for work, and thinking about the history, the predictability of this as a case is really, I think, something that within our city or even our country, for planners to not have an eye for this, and organizers to be keeping a lookout for these types of things to happen. I think it just really shows the value of those principles and how we can start to incorporate them in our work, because I think this is totally something that this could have been foreseen, and prepared for if there had been really thoughtful engagement and supporting communities as they need it.
Yeah, thank you for that.
And this is Heather, just to build on what Tiffany and Josh were saying as well. I'd encourage all of us especially in our small group discussions, to think about Josh's comment that why is this inevitable? Why does this keep happening again and again and again? And as I think back on the Black Space Manifesto list of comments, I think about how we build on the past and really look to that past, but also how can we manifest the future to make this not inevitable. Yeah, so I encourage all of us to kind of think on that and share some ideas in the small groups.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. Anything else? Because that is a great segue. So we'll be putting these questions in the chat for you, so you have them top of mind, and we'll be popping in and out as you break up into the groups. But to think about what Heather and folks are saying, which is just to identify, what are the interventions that need to happen to not make this inevitable, right? So what are the ideas that need to be in people's hearts and minds, of the various stakeholders that are a part of this, right? To how to make more equitable outcomes. So what needs to be in their hearts and minds? What kinds of behaviors or actions could people take? What are the systems that are helping, right? What aspects of the systems are hindering? So yeah, so to just keep those things in mind, to start naming, right? What are you seeing? What are you seeing as like the ideas that people are operating off of, and the things that people are doing, and what are the interventions? So we're going to break up into groups of 3 or 4 for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and have you each group share a couple of ideas from each of the domains and debrief when we come back. Okay. So.
Okay, I'm gonna send everyone to their room. Encourage you to unmute yourself and turn on your cameras in the small groups. Who's here with me still?